Hello, this is Rick Reardon. This week we'll be covering Chapter 3. This gets into more of the details about master patient indexes, primary and secondary uses of the medical record, and other topics. Let's take a look at Chapter 3. Okay, Chapter 3 is entitled Health Information Functions, Purposes, and Users. This is dealing with who, what, and when of patient care, which is supported by the who, what, when, and why of the medical record. This includes data, information, and knowledge. When we talk about primary purposes of the health record or the EHR, the medical record, we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about patient care purposes. Medical records are essential to manage patient care. They're also essential for the administrative purposes. So in other words, we have the right set of information lined up with the right patient. We talk about secondary purposes. We're talking about things that frequently are aggregate uses. Use for training of education of healthcare professionals, legal accreditation and policy development, quality improvement, public health and research purposes. Medical records, as we used to call the field, can be in several different formats. There are still facilities that do entirely paper records, such as Volunteers in Medicine here in Lane County. There are also electronic health records, and many times we see hybrid systems that have both paper and electronic medical records. Users of the health record include healthcare providers. And when we use the term aggregate data, we're talking about de-identified data, aggregate data, de-identified data. And then users can be individual users. The best example of this would be the patient care providers. We also have case managers, patient care managers. We have coding and billing staff. We have patients, employers, lawyers, law enforcement officials, healthcare researchers, and policymakers. These people are all individual users. We also have institutional users, and these include organization-wide users, third-party payers, medical review organizations, research organizations, educational organizations, accreditation organizations, and others. What the health information management functions basically do, they do such things as coding. We also have medical transcription, although this is being taken away by voice recognition and other things. A lot of these functions can either be in-house or outsourced to individual companies. Transcription is a popular one to outsource. And whatever information we have, it doesn't just stay usually in one organization. We have to release it and disclose it to other users, right? And this is release of information. So we need to disclose health information to those people that have a legitimate authorized use for it. And then coding reimbursement, basically what coding does is to assign alphanumeric strings of text to diagnostic statements or procedures. When we use the term abstracting, we're talking about instead of getting through all the minutia of every lab, every imaging, every patient encounter from registration to discharge, we're talking about a summary, basically taking the high points and putting it into a summary or an abstract. Coding supervisors are responsible for ensuring both the productivity and the quality of the codes that are coded. And these are essential for patient billing and reimbursement. As we transition from paper records to electronic records, something that was very popular a few years ago and is now falling by the wayside a little bit is document management systems. And these were things where we do scanning, manage different documents, and what have you. And an essential part of document management, although somewhat separate, is the master patient index. Whether you have paper or electronic health records, you need to have one way of identifying an individual patient with an individual set of data. And when we talk about this over an entire organization, we have enterprise MPIs. And frequently, when hospitals merge, whether they're using one EHR system, merging two EHR systems, or merging two sets of paper records, we have duplicate records, we have overlays, we have overlaps, and other MPI problems. Document management systems only work as well as the master patient index that sits upon them. Likewise, EHR systems only work and only make sense if you have each set of health information for each patient lined up completely correct with the right patient. When we talk about how to figure out what patient belongs to what set of records, we have different algorithms. We can do probabilistic, hybrid, or deterministic, where we're looking at different sets of identifiers to determine which patient belongs to which set of information. This could include demographic information, social security numbers, birth dates, and so on. And these are covered in greater detail in your text. Record storage is a big concern with paper records. And years ago, we did a lot of microfilm, microfiche, all of these different types of things. Now, with electronic health records, we don't have the same concerns about storage. But ultimately, if we generate enough patient data, even disk space has storage concerns. One of the things we can do is eliminate the filing and scanning of different medical records. Now, more and more, we're seeing things go in directly into an electronic health record. And these can be things that are in fields versus free text where people are just typing things in. And with record storage and retrieval in an electronic environment, ultimately, as we'll see, a lot of these functions, whether they're in a paper record or an electronic record, are the same. We still have data being entered in. Either it's keyed in or people are dictating reports and they're transcribed or what have you, right? Voice recognition has been helpful for many, many providers in terms of getting information in so they don't have to sit and type it away on a keyboard. Another thing to get the information out and get the data into a meaningful format is natural language processing. And this is a process of going through and finding common meaning to certain text screens and then putting them in an organized format. And again, now, of course, we can have video visits, we can have audio visits, what have you. All of these can be electronically stored and mapped to the same patient. And that's all I have for you. Please come back for the next video lecture and we'll finish off chapter 3. Thank you.